Today's January 9th, 2021, and it has been 3 days since the chaos took place in Washington, D.C. at Capitol Hill at the Capitol building. But it has also been 4 days since the Georgia Senate races, the runoff elections for the Senate race in Georgia. It's been 4 days since those took place. Those took place on January 5th, 2021, but the winners of those two Senate races were not declared until January 6th. For the Warnock versus Loeffler race, Raphael Warnock, who is the Democratic challenger, versus Kelly Loeffler, who is the Republican incumbent. In that race, Raphael Warnock was announced as the winner of that race sometime after midnight on January 6th. So it was early on in the day on January 6th, but for the Jon Ossoff versus David Perdue race, where David Perdue was the Republican incumbent and Jon Ossoff was the Democratic challenger, in that Senate race, Jon Ossoff also won as a Democratic challenger, but that was announced later on in the day. It was announced at around 11 a.m. on January 6th. So it was later on in the day, but it was also before all the chaos took place in the Capitol building at Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. So, because these two wins were announced right before all this chaos went down, people were only talking about it for a few hours, but right after the riots took place in Washington, D.C., everyone basically forgot about those two Senate races, but me included, I didn't really talk about those Senate races much, but I'm talking about it now in this video. So, both Democrats won their respective Georgia Senate races, so that means that both Senate seats in the state of Georgia are now controlled by Democrats, which is pretty insane when you consider that it went from two Republicans to two Democrats all on the exact same day, January 5th to January 6th. I want to talk about in this video not only why both Democrats won their respective Senate races in the state of Georgia, but also why Democrats as a whole were able to win their Senate races this time around, this election cycle, and why Democrats now control the Senate. So, first of all, let's go back to November 3rd, 2020, and the days following that day, because that's when the main 2020 elections took place. Let's talk about even before these dates, actually, leading up to election week. Around the last couple months before election day, the Republicans did not have that high of an approval rating overall. Not only did Trump have a relatively low approval rating, but also Republicans in the Senate did not have that high of an approval rating. The Republican Party as a whole, not that many people approved of, but here's something that is important to keep in mind. People didn't really hate the Republican GOP party as a whole necessarily as much as they hated Trump specifically. So, Trump himself, the president of the United States, he had a lot of people that didn't approve of him, but the Republicans as a whole, the GOP as a whole, and the Republicans in the Senate and the House, they didn't really have as low of an approval rating as Trump himself did, but their approval rating was still lower than usual because at the time, Democrats did control the House, but Republicans also controlled the Senate and controlled the presidency. And since 2020 was just a rough year for most people in general, a lot of people associated their suffering with who was in power. So at the time, it was President Trump, a Republican president, but it was also the Republican Senate. And yeah, the Democrats controlled the House, but that was only one chamber out of the three. The other two chambers were controlled by Republicans. So a lot of people did not approve of Republicans at the time. And Democrats were actually given a pretty good chance of winning the Senate. I talked about this several times on this channel preceding the 2020 elections, but 538.com gave Democrats leading up to the elections almost a three-fourths chance of controlling the Senate after the 2020 election. They had like a 73% chance or something, according to 538.com, 73% chance of controlling the Senate after the 2020 elections. And there were certain Senate races like Maine and North Carolina, where the Democratic challengers, were expected to win and take back the seats. There were also races like Arizona and Colorado, where the Democrats were given a really good chance of winning their respective Senate races. But there are many Senate races where the Democrats underperformed, meaning that they didn't do as well in the actual election as they were predicted to based on the polls and based on the projection models. So what that meant was that there were some Democrats who were given an above 50% chance of winning their Senate race that ended up losing. Two examples of these are the Maine Senate race and the North Carolina Senate race. In Maine, Sarah Gideon was given a higher chance of winning her Senate race than Susan Collins was, but as you probably know, Susan Collins won her Senate race by a pretty big margin. And then North Carolina, Cal Cunningham was given a slightly above 50% chance of winning his Senate race, but in the end, Tom Tillis, the incumbent for that Senate seat, ended up winning by a narrow margin. The margin was pretty small, it was like less than 2 percentage points, but those were two Senate races where the Republican came out on top, even though he or she was given a below 50% chance of winning. There were also Senate seats leading up to the 2020 Senate elections that were held by a Republican, but the Democrats were given a really good chance of winning in the 2020 Senate elections. For example, the Colorado Senate race and the Arizona Senate race. Before the 2020 elections, both of these Senate seats were held by Republicans. In Colorado, it was held by Cory Gardner, and in Arizona, it was held by Martha McSally, but both of the Senate races were expected to be won by Democrats by several percentage points, and they were expected to easily win their Senate races. I believe that 538.com gave each of the Democratic challengers an around 80% chance of winning. And indeed, both of the Democratic challengers for these two Senate races ended up winning their respective Senate seats. In Colorado, it was John Hickenlooper, the Democratic challenger. He was previously the governor of California, and he also, at one point, was running in the 2020 Democratic primaries, but he did drop out pretty early on. There was also Mark Kelly in Arizona, who was the Democratic challenger, and he was an astronaut before running for Senate, and he also won his Senate race against Martha McSally. So now that Senate seat in Arizona is being held by Mark Kelly, and he was given a really good chance of winning his Senate race. But even in the Senate races where the Democrats were expected to win, whether by a smaller margin or by a pretty large margin, like especially in the safe Democratic seats, even in a lot of these Senate races, the Democrats underperformed based on what 538.com was projecting and what the polls were predicting was going to happen. So overall, Republicans overperformed by quite a bit based on what the polls were saying and based on what projection models were saying. So Republicans actually did a lot better than expected. Even for the presidential election, Trump did better than what was expected from him based on the polls. Trump was given around only a 10% chance of winning the presidential election, and indeed he did lose the presidential election, and by quite a bit. Trump lost by the same margin this time around as he won by 4 years earlier, meaning that Trump got 306 electoral votes back in 2016, but this time around Joe Biden got that exact same number, 306. But even then, Trump did overperform based on what the polls were expecting because the polls had Joe Biden up by 7 to 8 percentage points for the popular vote leading up to election day, but on the actual election day, Joe Biden, and I guess in the days following that, because that's when a lot of the votes came in, Joe Biden ended up only winning the popular vote by around 5 percentage points, which is still a pretty decent margin. That's still a pretty solid margin. 5 percentage points is quite a bit. That's a pretty solid margin of victory, especially in a presidential election, but that's still less than what the polls would have predicted. So overall, Republicans did better in this election cycle than what was predicted. And once all was said and done, by the second week of November, it was confirmed that Joe Biden won the presidential election. He would be the 46th president of the United States. And by then, it was also confirmed that in North Carolina, North Carolina and Maine, even though the Democrats were given a better chance of winning according to 538.com, the Democratic challengers in both of those states lost their respective Senate races. In Arizona and Colorado, they were able to take back the Senate seats from the Republican incumbents. So Colorado and Arizona both have two Democratic senators now, when they both previously had one Democratic senator. So Arizona, the two Democrats are Kirsten Sinema and Mark Kelly. In Colorado, it's John Hickenlooper and Michael Bennet. There was also one Senate seat that was previously held by a Democrat, but a Republican was able to win over that Senate seat. This was in Alabama. Since 2017 to 2018, that Senate seat was being held by Democratic Senator Doug Jones, but the only reason why he was able to win that seat in such a conservative state like Alabama was because the person Doug Jones was running against in late 2017 was a very controversial figure. He was reported to have been the subject of lots of different scandals, and because of that, even when he was a Republican in the state of Alabama, his challenger still ended up losing his Senate race against a Democrat in Alabama. The Republican's name was Roy Moore, and he ended up losing to Doug Jones in the 2017 Alabama Senate special election. The reason why this election even took place in the first place, the special election, was because Jeff Sessions, who was previously holding that Senate seat, who was previously serving as a Republican senator from Alabama, he was asked by Donald Trump to serve in his administration. So in early 2017, Jeff Sessions left the Senate in order to be a part of the Trump administration, but a year or two later, Jeff Sessions ended up resigning his position that he held in the Trump administration. So I guess you could say it was all for nothing, but regardless, that seat is once again held by a Republican. His name is Tommy Tuberville. So now, leading up to the Georgia Senate runoff elections, you had Republicans having 50 seats, Democrats only having 48 seats. Before the 2020 Senate elections ever took place, the Democrats held 47 seats and the Republicans in the Senate held 53 seats. The 47 seats for the Democrats are, if you count Bernie Sanders and Angus King, who are both independents, but they do caucus with the Democrats and usually vote with the Democrats on issues, so that is why they're usually counted with the Democrats. So, in that aspect, the Democrats had 47 seats, Republicans had 53, meaning that if Joe Biden won the presidential election, Democrats would need 3 Senate seats, and if Joe Biden lost, they would need 4. The reason why it depended on whether or not Joe Biden won the election is because when there's a 50-50 tie in the Senate, meaning 50 people vote one way, 50 people vote the other way, because 100 is an even number that is bound to happen from time to time. In that instance, the person who casts the tiebreaker vote is actually the Vice President of the United States. So if 50 Republicans vote one way, 50 Democrats vote another way, usually the Vice President is going to cast the tiebreaker vote based on how the rest of the Vice President's political party votes. So if the Vice President is a Republican, then that person will likely vote with the other Republicans, and if the Vice President's a Democrat, likewise, that person will vote with the other Democrats. Now we know, and we've known since the second week of November, essentially, that Joe Biden would be the president of the United States, Kamala Harris would be the vice president of the United States. They're both Democrats. What matters specifically for the Senate is that Kamala Harris, the vice president, is a Democrat. And since she would be the tiebreaker vote and she's almost always going to side with the Democrats on issues, what matters is that Democrats get to 50 seats in the Senate if they wanted to control the Senate. So after the main 2020 elections happened in early November, there were 2 Senate seats previously held by Republicans that Democrats won over, but there was also 1 Senate seat previously held by a Democrat that Republicans won over. For the Democrats, they were able to win over Colorado and Arizona, and the Republicans were able to win over Alabama. Since the Democrats gained 2 seats and lost one, that was a net gain of one. Since the Democrats had 47 seats earlier, they ended up having 48 seats later on. And for the Republicans, they experienced a net loss of 1 Senate seat. So you would think that that would mean that they would have 52 seats in the Senate after the November 2020 elections, but they actually only had 50 at that point, and the reason why is because of the Georgia Senate elections. So this year in 2020, I guess it's last year now, both Senate seats in Georgia were up for re-election. Usually it's only one Senate seat per state at most, but this time around it was 2. And in both of these Senate races, none of the candidates got 50% of the votes or more. And Georgia law requires that a candidate wins the majority of the votes in a Senate race. If no candidate wins a majority, then the election has to go to a runoff election where the top 2 candidates from the original election move on to the runoff election. And that way, the round 2 of the election is guaranteed to have somebody get a majority. So for the normal election in Georgia, it was John Ossoff who got the second most number of votes and David Perdue got the most number of votes. They moved on to the runoff election. The thing about this election was that David Perdue was so close to getting majority. He had 49.7% of the votes. He was point 0.3 off. If he had just gotten a few more votes, he would have won that Senate seat, and Republicans would have controlled the Senate right then and there. But he barely missed the 50% threshold, so it went to a runoff election. For the special election, it was Kelly Loeffler who got second place, and Raphael Warnock who got first place in round 1. So Raphael Warnock and Kelly Loeffler went to the runoff election for the special Senate seat, special election. And leading up to the election, it looked like Republicans had a much better chance of winning their Senate races than Democrats did. But there are 3 main reasons I think why Democrats were able to pull off a win in the state of Georgia. The first reason is also the reason why Joe Biden won the state of Georgia in the presidential election, and it's because the Democrats got a lot of new people to turn out and vote for not only for Joe Biden but also for the 2 Democrats in the runoff elections. And Stacey Abrams played a big role in this. She was able to get many new people to turn out and vote for the Democrats. The second reason is because Trump claiming that there was election fraud. A lot of his supporters didn't even bother to vote for the Republican senators in the runoff elections because they thought that the election was rigged to begin with, even though it wasn't, even though Joe Biden won legitimately. A lot of people thought the elections were rigged and didn't bother to vote. The final reason is sort of similar, but some of the people who would have normally voted for Republicans in this election didn't do so because they thought that Perdue and Loeffler didn't do enough to investigate the voter fraud that they wrongfully thought was going on.